There was once a king who had 3 sons. One day he called his sons and he told them to each fashion an arrow and engrave their initials on the arrow and send their arrow in different directions. Whoever they found holding the arrow would be their bride. Well, the eldest son went first and he decided he would shoot to the east. And so off he went. And a beautiful daughter of a duke returned his arrow to him. Then it was the second son's turn and he shot his arrow to the west. And in time, the daughter of a general returned his arrow to him. Then it was the youngest son's turn and his name was Ivan. And Ivan decided to shoot his arrow straight ahead. But as soon as he released the arrow, it seemed to have a mind of its own. It swerved this way, it swerved that, it spun around and disappeared. And when no one returned, Ivan went off looking for it. He came to a marsh and then a bog. And there, sitting in the middle of the bog, he saw a frog in the bog. It can't be right. I can't marry a frog. I've got my whole life ahead of me. There must be some way out of this. Unfortunately, there was nothing that could be done. The wedding was the very next day. His brothers were there with their wives, and his wife was brought in on a dish, sitting in a stinking puddle, and oh, she was so happy with herself. She was goggling at Ivan the whole time and giving him sloppy, slimy kisses throughout. It was so embarrassing. And then they had to start living together. Well, that was a huge adjustment for Ivan. There wasn't much conversation. His wife kept hopping about the place, filling it with her mucus and sticky, grimy bits of blob and bog. Oh, it stank. And every day he had to go out and search for food for her. Worms, slugs, snails, crickets, locusts, and he had to feed them to her by hand because she wouldn't eat otherwise. Every night she hopped onto his pillow right next to his nose and she would goggle at him all night long and lick up the little beads of sweat that would form on his brow. One day the king called his sons and he gave each of them some fabric. He wanted his daughters-in-law to make him a shirt of the finest quality so he could test their skill. Ivan took the fabric and sank onto his bed. He couldn't help it. He had to cry. How could a frog make a shirt for a king? And his frog princess was hopping all around him and licking up his tears and making the fabric for the shirt absolutely filthy. Well, that night he fell into a fitful sleep. But as he slept, he noticed that the frog wasn't on his pillow as she usually was, and it was strange. He'd grown accustomed to her presence there. He looked around the room, and then he saw her. She was standing by the window, by the light of the moon, and she was scratching at herself. She was peeling at herself. She was peeling off her frog skin. She peeled it off, rolled it down, and revealed a beautiful woman with luminous, glowing skin like the moon, with quick, agile, quirky movements like the wind. She picked up the fabric, she threw it out into the sky. Winds, weave a shirt for the king. Moon, spin a shirt for the king, she said. The next morning, Ivan was sure that he had dreamt the entire thing, but he opened his eyes, and there was the shirt hanging on the chair. You couldn't see a single seam or stitch, and it glowed with a radiant beauty. The king was delighted with it. He put it on straight away and didn't even want to look at the other 2 shirts from the other wives. They're not even fit to be worn to bed, he said. And then he kept giving his daughters-in-law more and more tasks to do. He gave them flour to bake the finest bread, and then he gave them some marble to make a marble sculpture, earth to produce the most fragrant flour. And every time Ivan's wife produced the best, the fluffiest, lightest loaf, a marble sculpture of the king himself with his curling moustache, a fragrant exotic flower. And every night Ivan would see her doing the same thing, taking off her frog skin, completing the task, and then returning to her froggy self by morning. Well, the king decided he would throw a banquet, a ball to celebrate his daughters-in-law and present them to the kingdom. Well, Ivan desperately wanted his froggy wife to appear in her human form. How could he present a frog? And so that night, he gave her a task. And after she'd hung up her frog skin, he crept out of bed, took the skin, and threw it into the burning fire. Ksh! The girl turned and looked at him, her eyes full of pain. Ivan, if only you had waited. Ivan, if only you had trusted me. I will come to the ball, but after that I will disappear forever. She was true to her word. She did appear at the ball, and she easily outshone everyone else that was there with her almost unearthly beauty. The other two wives were so jealous of her that they decided they would imitate everything she did, since everything she did seemed to be so perfect. They noticed as she was eating, she was doing something very odd. She would eat a chicken leg and then stuff the bone up her sleeve. She'd have a sip of wine and then pour the rest of the wine up her sleeve. She'd have a bit of lettuce and then toss the rest of the salad up her sleeve. So the wives decided they would do exactly the same thing. Up their sleeves went berry mousse and gravy and some bits of chewed meat. And then it was time for the dancing. Well, the two wives had so much up their sleeves that as they flung their arms around, all the food went splattering across the ballroom. Oyster shells went skimming under people's noses. The king's beautiful shirt had gravy stains and blobs of jelly all over it. It was so humiliating. But when Ivan's wife rose to dance, well, it was a sight to be seen. Kalinka, kalinka, kalinka maya, sadhu yagada malinka, malinka maya, kalinka, kalinka, kalinka maya, sadhu yagada laminka, malinka maya. And then as she spread her arms out of her sleeves came great rivers and luscious lakes, gardens of green grass, rolling hills. The whole ballroom was transformed. But when the music stopped, it all disappeared, and so did she. Ivan was heartbroken. He knew that this was all his fault. He simply had to win her back. And so he went looking for her. He crossed the thrice 9 realms of old Mother Russia until he reached a cottage resting on 2 very hairy, very knock-kneed chicken legs. The house said when she saw Ivan, "Please, I'm looking for my frog princess. Tell me where I can find her, and I will accept her in any form she takes." "Any form? Well then, Ivan, you'd better come inside." So Ivan climbed up the hairy chicken legs, hair by hair, and went into the hut. And there was his wife. He reached for her, but she immediately turned into a frog and tried to get away. He held on tight, but then she was a snake slithering all over him. Then a chicken clucking and pecking at him. Then a bear roaring and gnawing at him. Finally, she turned into an arrow. The prince broke the arrow across his knee. And there she stood in front of him, free. They lived in a land of shimmering lakes and rolling hills and thick forests, and they were happy. But if she ever got annoyed with Ivan, she would turn back into her froggy self once more. But Ivan didn't mind. In fact, he sometimes irritated her on purpose, so he could have another one of those juicy, sloppy, slimy kisses.